How Rangers Broke the Comanche's Supernatural Chief. Some say the most dangerous moments come wrapped in perfect peace. On May 12, 1858, as dawn broke over western Oklahoma, neither the Texas Rangers nor their Comanche adversaries knew this peaceful morning would mark one of the bloodiest chapters in frontier history. Welcome to Native Legends and History Stories. If you're fascinated by the untold tales of America's frontier, hit subscribe and join us every week for more gripping historical narratives. The first hints of sunrise paint the Oklahoma sky in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the sleeping Comanche camp. Inside the largest lodge, Chief Pujihitswa drifts between sleep and wakefulness, his body warm beneath layers of softened buffalo hide blankets. Silence blankets the camp. No cooking fires have been lit yet. No morning bustle has begun. This is Quahati territory, the domain of the Antelope Eaters as they're known among their own people. Their claim to these vast expanses of present-day Oklahoma and northern Texas has been written in blood and valor across generations. These rolling plains, with their hidden valleys and abundant hunting grounds, represent more than just land to the Quahati. They are the heart of their identity, their sovereignty, their very survival. But their hold on this homeland grows more precarious with each passing season. Texas settlements push ever northward at an unprecedented pace, bringing with them fences, farms, and an end to the free-ranging lifestyle that sustains the Comanche people. The Quahati's response has been swift and merciless. Their raids into Texas territories have escalated to levels that strike terror even into hardened frontier hearts. No settlement is safe from their lightning raids. From isolated homesteads nestled in river valleys to sprawling farmsteads dotting the prairie, even to the outskirts of significant cities like San Antonio and Austin. The Comanche war parties sweep down from Oklahoma to northern Mexico, leaving a trail of devastation that has effectively halted the tide of settlement. Their reputation for ferocity surpasses anything known before, even among settlers raised in the harsh frontier territories of Kentucky, Arkansas, and Virginia, where Indian attacks were commonplace. The mere mention of Comanche raiders spreads paralyzing fear. Their tactics are brutally efficient. Fighting-age men are killed without mercy, women are taken captive, and any prisoners who might slow their lightning-fast retreats, including infants, are eliminated. Those unfortunate enough to survive the initial attack often face ritualized torture. Across the frontier, families vanish without trace, entire communities abandon their homes overnight, fleeing in terror at the mere rumor of approaching Comanche warriors. But among all the terrifying tales that survivors bring back, one detail stands out as particularly chilling. Their mysterious chief, who rides into battle wearing not just traditional war paint and feathers, but the gleaming steel breastplate of a Spanish conquistador. This ancient piece of armor, looking as out of place in 1858 as it would today, carries its own dark legend. Some say it was stripped from a conquistador's corpse after a desperate battle in some forgotten corner of the frontier. Others believe it was traded or taken as tribute from one of the many tribes the Comanche had conquered and scattered to the winds. The Spanish breastplate that adorned Iron Jacket was far more than mere decoration. It was a powerful symbol of both physical and spiritual protection. In combat, the thick steel plating effectively deflected the crude lead balls fired from most frontier weapons. But its psychological impact proved even more valuable. During raids, the sight of bullets seemingly bouncing off their chief's chest filled Comanche warriors with supernatural confidence while striking terror into settler communities. Pujihitswa earned his nickname, Iron Jacket, through a series of daring raids where he led from the front, seemingly immune to settler firearms. His tactical genius showed in how he organized raiding parties, typically groups of 20 to 30 elite warriors mounted on their fastest horses. They would strike multiple settlements in rapid succession, using the superior speed and stamina of their plains ponies to outmaneuver any pursuit. Under his leadership, the Quahati band accumulated vast herds of captured horses and a fearsome reputation that spread from Texas to Mexico. Their most recent raid near present-day Brownwood, Texas, demonstrated their brutal efficiency. The war party covered 300 miles of hostile territory undetected, struck multiple homesteads before dawn, and disappeared back into Comanche territory with dozens of captured horses and valuable supplies. The death toll, though never accurately counted, included entire families of settlers who had ignored warnings about building so close to Comanche territory. This success bred a dangerous overconfidence. From their camp deep in the Oklahoma plains, Iron Jacket and his warriors felt untouchable. The vast grasslands that had swallowed so many pursuing Passes gave them a sense of invulnerability. Previous attempts to track Comanche raiders across these plains had ended in disaster. Parties of vengeful settlers either fell to Comanche ambushes or became hopelessly lost in the featureless terrain, ultimately succumbing to thirst and exposure. But while the Comanche grew confident, the Texas Rangers were evolving. Officially established on October 17, 1835, they were conceived as a unique hybrid organization, combining military might with law enforcement authority. Their primary mission was threefold: suppress bandit activity, counter Mexican army incursions, and most crucially, defend against Comanche raids that terrorized the frontier settlements. The 23-year period between their founding and the events of 1858 saw dramatic evolution in their capabilities. Rangers learned to survive in the harsh prairie environment, developed effective tracking techniques, and gradually built an intelligence network that included both settlers and friendly native tribes. However, this progress came at a staggering cost. Their casualty rates consistently hovered around 50%, meaning that for every 2 Rangers who rode out to confront the Comanche, only 1 typically returned. Chronic underfunding plagued the organization throughout these years. Rangers often had to supply their own horses, weapons, and provisions. Public opinion swung wildly. Some frontier newspapers painted them as heroic defenders of civilization, while others condemned them as reckless vigilantes. These challenges, combined with political pressures, led to multiple disbandments and reorganizations, each time forcing the Rangers to rebuild their institutional knowledge almost from scratch. The tide began to turn in early 1858 when newly elected Governor Hardin Richard Runnels took office. Facing intense pressure to fulfill his campaign promises about ending frontier violence, Runnels made a bold decision. On January 28, 1858, he issued a historic dispatch to his carefully chosen commander, John Salmon Rip Ford. The order was unprecedented. Instead of merely reacting to Comanche raids, Ford's Rangers were authorized to pursue hostile natives deep into their own territory, no matter how far the chase might lead. This aggressive new strategy marked a fundamental shift in frontier warfare. For the first time, the Rangers would take the fight directly to the Comanche homeland, challenging their long-held dominance of the southern plains. The success or failure of this daring plan would rest largely on the shoulders of Rip Ford, a man whose reputation for both courage and cunning made him Runnels' natural choice for such a dangerous mission. Governor Runnels' dispatch to Ford was direct and unequivocal. "I impress upon you the necessity of action and energy. Follow any trail and all the hostiles or suspected hostile Indians you may discover, and if possible, overtake and chastise them if unfriendly." For Ford, this order wasn't unexpected. He'd been preparing for such a mission throughout his remarkable career. John Salmon Ford's journey to this moment began in South Carolina in 1815. His early life took him through Tennessee before he arrived in Texas in 1836, building a diverse background that would serve him well in frontier warfare. Far from the typical rough-hewn frontiersman, Ford was a Renaissance man, a trained lawyer, practicing physician, and veteran of the Texas Mounted Rifles during the Texas Revolution. By the 1840s, Ford had joined the Rangers, serving alongside frontier legends whose names still echo through Texas history: Bigfoot Wallace, the McCulloch brothers Ben and Henry, Matthew Old Paint Caldwell, and Jack Coffee Hayes. These campaigns weren't without cost. In one particularly brutal encounter with the Comanche, Ford lost a finger and barely escaped with his life. Several other close calls left him with an intimate understanding of Comanche warfare. The nickname Rip came during his service as a lieutenant and medical officer in the Mexican War. Tasked with the grim duty of notifying families about fallen soldiers, his habit of signing death notices with R.I.P., rest in peace, earned him this somber moniker. Between campaigns, Ford settled in Austin, where he became known as an unlikely combination of Sunday school teacher, newspaper publisher, and playwright. The peaceful interlude ended after the devastating summer of 1857. Ford was called back to active service and established his Ranger contingent at Fort Belknap, northwest of present-day Dallas. Here, through the winter months, he focused on reviving the aggressive tactical doctrine pioneered by Jack Hayes, rapid-fire assaults that could match Comanche mobility and ferocity. This training was desperately needed. Recent years had seen numerous young Rangers fall victim to sophisticated Comanche battle tactics. The natives were masters of the feigned retreat, luring pursuing Rangers into carefully planned ambushes where superior numbers and terrifying violence would overwhelm the inexperienced troopers. Recognizing the limitations of his Rangers in tracking their elusive enemy, Ford relied heavily on native scouts, particularly a skilled Tonkawa named Kitchie. In early 1858, while Ford drilled his men at Fort Belknap, Kitchie ventured deep into the Northwestern Territories. The success of their entire operation hinged on these scouts. Without their almost supernatural ability to read the prairie's subtle signs, even the most experienced frontiersmen would be helpless in Comanche territory. Ford's anxious wait ended in April when Kitchie returned to Fort Belknap with vital intelligence about a Comanche village far to the northwest. The experienced scout had discovered them hunting near the Canadian River, their movements suggesting they planned to stay in the area. Ford knew they needed to move immediately. Any delay could allow their quarry to slip away into the vast expanse of Indian Territory. On April 22nd, the Rangers departed Fort Belknap's protective walls, their columns stretching along the Brazos River as they moved northwest. Ford had assembled a formidable force, 102 hand-picked Rangers, each man chosen for his riding ability and marksmanship. Their supply train consisted of 2 heavily loaded wagons carrying essential ammunition and weapons, a specially equipped field ambulance wagon for treating casualties, and 15 pack mules laden with additional supplies. The expedition reached Cottonwood Springs, where their fighting force nearly doubled in size. Captain Shafley T. Ross brought 113 native warriors to join their cause, creating an unprecedented alliance. These warriors came from tribes that had suffered grievously at Comanche hands, proud fighters of the Tonkawa, Waco, Shawnee, Delaware, and Tawakoni nations. Each tribe brought their own combat techniques and tracking skills, though they shared a burning desire for vengeance against the Comanche who had raided their villages and killed their people. The crossing of the Red River on April 29th marked a crucial transition. As the combined force moved beyond Texas jurisdiction into Indian country, they adopted strict frontier survival protocols. Ford ordered his men to travel light, abandoning conventional military supplies in favor of additional ammunition and weapons. This decision meant living off the land. Hunting became their primary means of sustenance. Rangers and their native allies pursued deer and rabbit through the prairie grass, though buffalo meat was most prized. The great herds were particularly abundant in 1858, providing vital sustenance for the expedition. On May 10th, several scouts had brought down a buffalo, but during butchering, they made a critical discovery. Comanche arrowheads were embedded in the animal's flesh. The buffalo had recently escaped a Comanche hunting party, meaning their quarry was near. Ford immediately dispatched additional scouts in all directions, spreading out across the rolling prairie to locate the Comanche hunters. The atmosphere in camp grew tense with anticipation. Rangers cleaned their weapons obsessively while native allies prepared for battle according to their tribal customs. When the scouts returned, their news electrified the camp. They had discovered not just a hunting party, but had followed them back to a significant Comanche encampment along the Canadian River. Ford knew they needed to strike quickly before their presence was detected. In the pre-dawn darkness, he roused his men from their cold camp. As Rangers checked their weapons and saddled horses, their native allies took a crucial precaution, wrapping white cloth strips around their heads to prevent friendly fire in the confusion of battle. This simple but effective measure had been learned through bitter experience in previous frontier conflicts. Kitchie, their most trusted scout, provided detailed intelligence about the Comanche position. He had discovered two separate villages, a smaller settlement of 5 lodges that would be their initial target, and a much larger encampment across the river housing approximately 350 warriors, not counting women and children. This larger force posed a significant threat if alerted to their presence. Ford devised a careful battle plan. His 73-year-old father, Captain William Ford, would remain behind with a small guard force to protect their supply wagons, field ambulance, and pack mules. The main force would make a 6-mile approach march under cover of darkness to strike the smaller village at first light. At precisely 7 a.m., the attack began. Rangers and allied warriors swept into the smaller village with devastating effect, but amid the chaos and gunfire, 2 Comanche warriors managed to slip away. These escapees immediately headed for the larger village, 3 miles distant across the river. Ford recognized the critical danger. If these warriors successfully raised the alarm, his entire force would face overwhelming numbers. He immediately ordered a pursuit, leading his rangers and most allied warriors in a desperate race to prevent disaster. However, many Tonkawa warriors, driven by generations of hatred and a desire for revenge, remained behind in the captured village. Their actions, adding another dark chapter to the long history of tribal warfare on the southern plains. The Tonkawa warriors who remained behind in the captured village carried generations of bitter hatred toward the Comanche. Since the early 1800s, they had watched their ancestral lands in central Texas gradually fall to Comanche expansion. Year after year, Comanche raiders had struck their villages, killing their warriors, kidnapping their women and children, and stealing their prized horse herds. Sacred burial grounds of their ancestors had been desecrated, traditional hunting grounds seized, and entire Tonkawa bands scattered or exterminated. Now, with modern weapons in hand and their ancient enemies at their mercy, the Tonkawa unleashed decades of pent-up vengeance, systematically burning every lodge, killing any Comanche they found, and seizing anything of value. Meanwhile, Ford's main force encountered treacherous conditions at the Canadian River crossing. The spring rains had swollen the river, creating deep pools and treacherous quicksand. Rangers and their allies struggled to find safe passage, many forced to dismount and lead their horses through chest-deep water. The powerful current swept several horses off their feet, leaving their riders stranded on foot. These dismounted men, carrying heavy weapons and waterlogged ammunition, desperately tried to keep pace with their mounted companions, knowing that every minute lost increased the chance of a prepared Comanche defense. Their worst fears were realized. The 2 escaped Comanche warriors, riding superior horses and knowing every trail, reached the main village well ahead of their pursuers. Iron Jacket was at his morning fire, probably drinking coffee traded from Mexican merchants, when the exhausted riders burst into camp. Their warnings echoed across the village. Armed white men and their native allies were approaching in force. The legendary chief sprang into action, his commanding presence steadying the initial panic. While ordering his families to prepare for immediate evacuation, he methodically armed himself for battle. The Spanish breastplate, believed by many to possess powerful medicine that could deflect bullets, was carefully secured over his chest. Iron Jacket led his warriors out at full gallop, not merely to defend their village, but to destroy the attacking force entirely. Their initial charge met the Rangers' native allies, who had managed to outpace the main Ranger force by several hundred yards. The Comanche warriors, expecting to face traditionally armed opponents, rode confidently into battle. What they encountered instead was devastating. The Rangers had equipped their allied warriors with the latest Winchester repeating rifles and Colt 6-shot revolvers, weapons capable of delivering unprecedented volumes of fire. The sound of modern weapons in native hands shocked the Comanche. Their traditional tactics of close-quarter combat with lances and shields proved disastrous against this new threat. As Ford's Rangers finally arrived on the battlefield, they added their own firepower to the devastating fusillade. Iron Jacket, charging at the head of his warriors, suddenly pitched forward in his saddle. Multiple bullets had found gaps in his ancient armor, proving that no medicine, no matter how powerful, could withstand modern firearms. His death threw the Comanche into disarray. Their legendary leader, believed invulnerable to bullets, lay dead alongside his warhorse. The surviving Comanche warriors retreated in confusion to their village, their world shaken by the loss of their seemingly invincible chief. Ford's combined force pursued aggressively, but the battle soon lost any semblance of organized combat. Over an area spanning 18 square miles, small groups of warriors clashed in desperate, personal combat. Rangers would later describe scenes of incredible bravery on both sides. Comanche warriors charging with lances against pistol-wielding rangers, native allies engaging in traditional hand-to-hand combat, and mounted skirmishes between expert horsemen. After several hours of this scattered fighting, Ford managed to reassemble his forces at the captured Comanche village. The experienced commander knew they had limited time. The Comanche were famous for their ability to gather large forces quickly for counterattacks. His men searched the village methodically, gathering intelligence about other Comanche bands in the area while collecting anything that might support their continued campaign. The focus was on practical items, weapons, ammunition, and supplies that could sustain their force deep in hostile territory. Back at the captured village, Ford found an urgent situation developing. Captain Shapley Ross, who had originally commanded the native allies when they joined forces on the Brazos River, was rapidly organizing warriors into battle formation. His years of frontier experience told him the Comanche would mount a fierce counterattack. It was never a question of if, but when. As Ford assessed their position, a disturbing realization struck him. Two of his youngest rangers, Privates Oliver Searcy and Robert Nichols, were missing from the ranks. The mystery of their fate was partially solved when Oliver Searcy stumbled into camp, his uniform caked with river mud and torn from thorny brush. Between desperate gasps for air, the young ranger recounted a harrowing tale. He and Nichols had been among those who lost their horses in the treacherous crossing of the Canadian River, their mounts mired in the deep, clutching mud. Determined not to miss the fight, they had pushed forward on foot, their youth and enthusiasm driving them toward the sound of gunfire. Missing the initial engagement that claimed Iron Jacket's life, they pursued retreating Comanche warriors toward the northwest, caught up in the thrill of the chase. Their eagerness proved fatal. In a scenario that had claimed countless young rangers before them, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by Comanche warriors who had turned the tables on their pursuers. Cut off from any support, the two rangers made a desperate sprint for a series of deep ravines near the river. They fought as they ran, turning periodically to fire at their pursuers, but the Comanche pressed their advantage relentlessly. Nichols, perhaps a step slower or simply less fortunate, was overtaken. Searcy could only watch helplessly as Comanche lances ended his friend's life. Using the ravine's maze-like passages, Searcy managed to evade his pursuers, spending terrifying hours hiding in the shadows of the steep-walled gullies before finding his way back to camp. The young ranger was visibly traumatized, his hands still shaking on his rifle, but his warning was clear. More Comanche warriors were approaching. The words had barely left Searcy's lips when Captain Ross spotted riders approaching their position. Leading them was a warrior whose very presence commanded attention, Peta Nacona, son of the fallen Iron Jacket. He cut an imposing figure, tall and powerfully built, already known and respected throughout the territory as a skilled warrior and tactician. Now, with his father's blood fresh on the ground, he led his warriors with deadly purpose. The tactical situation quickly became complex. Peta Nacona demonstrated his military acumen, maneuvering his warriors through a dense thicket that ran along the sloping riverbank. Captain Ross, conferring urgently with Ford and the native allies, expressed serious concern about the Comanche securing the high ground behind their position. Such a move would leave the Rangers dangerously exposed and potentially cut off from retreat. However, the tense strategic discussion was interrupted by an extraordinary act of individual courage, or perhaps bravado. A Tonkawa scout, carrying only the traditional weapons of spear and shield, suddenly spurred his horse into the no-man's land between the two forces. What followed seemed to transport the modern-day participants back centuries in time. The lone warrior, silhouetted against the open prairie, began shouting traditional challenges and insults at the Comanche force assembled on the ridge. This dramatic gesture embodied centuries of tribal enmity between Tonkawa and Comanche peoples. The scouts' actions went beyond mere military bravado. It was a cultural challenge, rooted in ancient traditions of single combat and personal honor. To the Rangers watching, it seemed like a scene from a medieval tournament, yet it was deadly serious. The fate of the entire engagement might hinge on how Peta Nacona would respond to this bold challenge. For over 30 minutes, mounted fighters clashed in personal duels, their war cries echoing across the battlefield. Spears met shields, horses wheeled and charged, while the ancient rituals of plains warfare played out before the astonished Rangers' eyes. Ford recognized this display of tribal combat as more than mere spectacle. It provided the tactical advantage he needed. He quickly assembled a detachment under Lieutenant Allison Nelson's command, ordering them to execute a wide flanking maneuver around the Comanche position. Their objective was to cut off all possible escape routes and trap Peta Nacona's warriors between multiple forces. Simultaneously, Ford began reorganizing his native allies near the village, preparing for a massive frontal assault. However, the complex ballet of coordinated warfare fell apart when a group of Tonkawa warriors, their bloodlust overwhelming any semblance of discipline, charged ahead of the main force. Their premature attack alerted Peta Nacona to the Rangers' broader strategy. The young Comanche leader had already achieved his primary objective, buying time for the women and children to evacuate the village. With this accomplished, he saw no reason to risk further casualties in a pitched battle. He orchestrated a masterful fighting retreat, leading his warriors over the rolling hills while keeping the pursuing Tonkawa at bay with skilled rearguard actions. A captured Comanche woman brought alarming intelligence to Ford's attention. A much larger camp lay nearby under the command of the legendary war chief Buffalo Hump. This development forced Ford to reevaluate his position. If Peta Nacona's forces joined with Buffalo Hump's warriors, the combined Comanche force would vastly outnumber the Ranger expedition. The threat of an overwhelming counterattack loomed large. Ford quickly ordered defensive measures. The 16 Comanche prisoners were securely shackled, wounded fighters were carefully loaded onto the ambulance wagon, and preparations began for a tactical withdrawal to Texas territory. As they waited for the Tonkawa pursuers to return, the full brutality of tribal warfare became evident. The returning warriors' horses bore grotesque trophies, hands, feet, and strips of flesh from their Comanche victims, all swaying grotesquely in the prairie wind. The final casualty count reflected the battle's ferocity. 76 Comanche warriors dead, while Ford's forces lost the young Ranger Nichols and a single Waco warrior who fell during the one-on-one combat. On May 13th, the combined force began their long journey back to the Brazos Agency, arriving to heroes' welcomes on May 20th. Governor Runnels and his supporters heralded the expedition as vindication of their aggressive new Indian policy. Though hailed as a decisive victory by Governor Runnels and his supporters, the Battle of Antelope Hills would unleash consequences far beyond anyone's expectations. Buffalo Hump and Peta Nacona transformed their grief and rage into a devastating campaign of retaliation. Their combined forces struck deeper into settled territories than ever before, pioneering lethal new tactics that merged traditional Comanche horsemanship with captured modern weapons. Under this relentless assault, frontier settlements crumbled, Texas defenses stretched to breaking point, and the tide of westward expansion temporarily reversed. Yet amidst this violence, an extraordinary chapter of frontier history was unfolding. Peta Nacona, whose tactical brilliance had saved many of his people at Antelope Hills, would later marry a white captive named Cynthia Ann Parker. Their union produced 3 children, including a son named Quanah. This child of 2 worlds would eventually become the last great chief of the Comanche people, bridging the chasm between cultures that the battle had torn so violently wide. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to Native Legends and History Stories for more gripping tales from America's frontier. Join us next week as we uncover another forgotten chapter of our shared past.